All right, we are live. So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to, I guess it's afternoon everywhere now, this meeting of the Legislative Studies Virtual Workshop. Today's agenda is to discuss a paper by Jim Curry entitled Knowledge, Expertise, and Committee Power in Congress. Generally how we do this is we rotate through the panel and get comments with respect to first the framing and overview of the paper. We move on to theory, research design, empirics, and then we a last round of any closing thoughts. I'll go through sequentially, but feel free to raise your hand or in Keith's case, cough if you want to jump in with a two-finger interruption or add on to something someone says. So it doesn't have to be as structured as I set it up. We don't have a formal presentation, but Jim, I will let you open up and just tell us a little bit about the project and what you're hoping to get out of a process today. So go ahead, Jim.
Okay, and Jason and Nate, thanks as always for putting this together. You guys are doing incredible work with this. And Scott, Josh, Keith, and Richard, thanks so much for taking the time to read this paper and provide feedback. I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to say. This paper really sort of comes out of, sort of kind of extends out of my book, which I recently just published. It's looking at information and power in Congress. I think I realized while I was working on that I had something to say beyond just leadership power, that information should and does play something of a significant role with committee power. And you know, this paper is, I think, still in the relatively early stages, so I think this would be a great time to get some really critical feedback, so I'm looking forward to it.
Great. Anybody want to volunteer to go first? Rick, you're first on my screen. Why don't you go first?
Okay. So in the guidelines, you suggested an order to, you know, how we should take up topics. And I think the first one was to talk about the framing of the paper. So I thought I would start there. I am immensely sympathetic to the argument here that knowledge and expertise, you know, play an important role in committee power. In this respect, I'm a student of Keith Krehbiel, and you cite his informational legislative organization, which, you know, I think, you know, is exactly what you should do. I think that's, you know, the, you know, most important work on this topic. But I think maybe the better framing for this paper might be more like cue giving, something like committee leader cue giving on amending and voting on the floor, because, you know, I don't think empirically you're really capturing knowledge or expertise. You know, I mean, that comes out in the interviews, but when you get to the more systematic analysis of amendments and voting on amendments, that you're really getting the cue from the committee leader, which could be based on expertise. That could be the mechanism that's making his cues influential on, you know, on the amendments passage or the voting decisions. But, you know, I don't really have a good sense that you're really capturing that. And so I guess I'm thinking, you know, maybe the emphasis needs to be a little less on.
Okay, Josh, you want to go next?
Sure. Everybody can hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. You know, I had some thoughts, I think, similar to those just expressed by Rick, which is I think the paper is really interesting. You've got some really good data. I tend to feel right now that the framing is a little bit broad and it doesn't seem particularly directed. There's a lot of broad discussion of information, and you talk about the role of committees a little bit. But it just reading the framing, I wasn't actually sure where the paper was going, because it's not clear immediately that you're talking about committees as a source of information, or committee members as a source of information for members when they're voting. So I wonder if it would make sense to be a little bit more specific when you start the paper and you talk about how committees might possess more information than other members, especially on certain types of topics. You can talk about cue giving a little bit more, as Rick just suggested. I think the key point you're trying to make is that there are procedural changes in the way that committees operate, in the way that the leadership and the members use committees, but I think you're trying to argue that despite those changes, committees are still important sources of information and influence, especially when it comes to voting, and I don't think you're quite there yet. I think you need to kind of bring a sharper focus on that with respect to the frame. It also seems to me that you kind of set up the paper, you seem to be trying to draw some implicit comparisons with some of the parties' literature, but that doesn't really seem to come through a lot in the theory, and it doesn't seem to be consistent throughout the paper. So I'm not exactly sure how you're trying to address that literature and what you're trying to do with that, because you're sort of using it to say committees aren't really doing what they used to do, and here's what some of the parties people say, but maybe that's not really what's going on. But I'm going to talk about committees and information, and it's just not really explicit how you're drawing a contrast with the parties' literature, especially in the framing part, I think. So I'll stop there, and I'll Jason, go ahead.
Keith.
Okay. So I'm gonna encourage you, or at least plant an idea in you, to do something a little bit bolder in framing this.
Okay.
First of all, overall, I like the paper a lot, and I'm not surprisingly sympathetic to and in agreement with most of what you argue. But I just want to start on page 1, where you say that political science's understanding of committee power is rooted in congressional rules. And then you continue, because they have procedural rights to gatekeep legislation, propose policies to the floor, and exercise an ex post veto in conference committee. Then your paper overall argues that while exercising these rights is still vital to the process as sources of knowledge and expertise, cue giving, etc. Cue giving and the like are enduring sources of influence. So what I wanted to say is I mostly agree with that conclusion, but I don't agree with the premises in the argument. And this all stems from what I regard as a critical distinction that you don't draw but should draw between 3 things. 1 is norms, 2 is rights, and 3 is power. And I'll elaborate a little bit on each of those. By norms, I mean primarily behavioral phenomena, behavioral regularities. Some things that happen so regularly that they're treated in the literature as if they're institutions, or as if they're procedures. So examples are things that you call, quote, rooted in congressional rules, which mostly, in fact, are not rooted in congressional rules. That is, for example, there's no gatekeeping rule in the House of Representatives. There's no ex post veto rule. There's no guaranteed closed rule on conference reports. All of those things are just behavioral practices. They're not codified. They're not enforceable. So those are things that go into the category of norms, not under rules. The second concept that I think needs to be used more sharply is that of rights, and I think this is what we typically mean when we talk about rules or procedures. It's a specification, usually codified, that says what legislators can do and when they can do it in the legislative game. So this is that's what I mean by rights. Examples would be committee jurisdictions or committee assignment processes. And then the third concept that you use, I think, much too carelessly, and your argument can be much sharper if it's defined narrowly, is that of power. So you write about agenda powers of committees. And the way I see it, power is a possible consequence of an institutional feature as an allocation of rights, but it's not a necessary consequence. Whether power actually occurs, that is, whether an outcome is actually influenced or behavior is actually influenced, depends upon how the game is played. So when you add all of this up and put it in the context of the framing of your paper, your real argument, I think, is bigger and bolder and more interesting when these distinctions are made. Because it goes something like this: committee power is presumed to be grounded in institutional features, whereas you say it is grounded in, you say that conventional wisdom is that it is grounded in institutional features. So if you say instead committee power is presumed to be grounded in institutional features like gatekeeping, restrictive rules, bill introduction referral, monopoly agenda setting, and so on, that's actually overstated because all of those are as-if institutions. They're not codified formal rules. So what you present is a fact, and the fact is that this kind of as-if properties, as-if behavioral patterns were rules, has dissipated in recent Congresses. And that affirms that they are not really as constraining as it seemed. And the figures you have on this are just terrific. I think those 5 figures are really powerful and important. But it could be framed better by thinking of 2 hypotheses. First hypothesis is a conventional wisdom or institutionalist hypothesis. And that holds that, the recent changes that you show in the figures should undermine committee power. You show that that's not true. You show the alternative hypothesis is that even these are just as-if institutions. Once they're circumvented, they're shown not to be, they're shown, first of all, not to have the institutional force that they're often assumed to have. And that's interesting in and of itself. But the really fascinating thing is that because they're circumvented and committees remain powerful, that casts doubt on whether those as-if institutions were in fact constraining all along. So what you're showing is you're showing the committee power is durable and enduring, and it probably doesn't belong, doesn't derive from formal explicit rights, and it doesn't even depend fundamentally upon these norms or these as-if institutions. That was kind of a lot at once, but
that's great.
you can try to sharpen it up if you have questions.
Scott?
Yeah, that's great, Keith. And it got me thinking slightly differently about my perception of the framing of this, because I have to admit that I was in a lot of ways leaning in the direction of Rick and Josh's thinking about cue giving. It seemed to me that this was a lot about cue giving. And the other question that came to mind here as I was, really right from the start of the paper, which was, what does expertise look like if all of these norms, these things that we've seen over time, these things we've seen over time with respect to what committees were able to do, control legislation within their jurisdictions, gatekeep. How does expertise accrue if they're not doing that anymore? And so I really like the way Keith sort of characterized this a moment ago, which was to say, well, we're still seeing power to some degree, but it's not, doesn't seem to be grounded in our normal perceptions of the vaunted role that committees play or have traditionally played in Congress, and therefore what is underneath all of that, and that may be, and that's where I think you can bring in the cue giving here as this influence that they have. But I guess if I were to start getting into the next stage, the sort of theoretical framework of the paper, if that's okay, can I move on to that? So, and this was this I think these questions came to mind well before we got into any of the interview data or the more empirical data, which was I was having trouble sort of understanding what expertise looked like in a world where committees didn't really control legislation within their jurisdiction. And it was expertise ex ante? Did members just bring expertise with them to their committee assignments? And I think to some degree, Jim, you suggest that some of that is going on, of course. Or the other thing that I saw you talking about here, which was that committees still seem to play a role in the crafting of legislation, the construction of legislation. The only thing they weren't doing to the same degree that they used to be, which was reporting the bills. So that was where I was wondering why are the rank and file, why are the non-committee members turning to the committee members for cues or for information if it's not clear where that what's underneath that expertise?
It's a good question. I think it's, maybe I touch on this a little bit in the paper. I think they turn to these members largely out of necessity, and they think they still view at least some members of each committee as knowing at least way more than they do about these issues, even if just in the abstract. So it's somebody they can turn to glean at least some insight, even if the committee didn't formally report or act on the bill.
But just let me just add one follow-up, and then I'll open. But it sounded to me, though, the characterization you were offering about committee's role in legislation was they're still crafting these bills.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, often, I think a lot of the time, probably most of the time, especially with these bills that don't go through, especially these big major bills, so like the larger bills, the omnibus bills that aren't going through traditional committee processes. I think key committee members, the senior members, the leadership, and other key committee members, and the committee staff who are working with the leadership when the leadership may be taking the lead on the political negotiations with the other party and with the other chamber and with the White House. But I think it's the members, some of the key members and the staffers who are still engaged and still working in writing and drafting and putting together the final bill that they're going to use for floor consideration. That's, how I can make somebody more satisfied or convinced of that is another question.
Yeah.
So I really like Keith's analysis, his recommendations. I think that really characterizes the first half of the paper, reframes the first half of the paper really well. That is, what your introductory discussion and what those initial graphs show is what power does not depend on, right? That we can't presume that it relies on these what are labeled institutional features that may just be behavioral regularities. But then what you want to do is move and say, well, it must depend on something else because we still observe committee power. And so what I want to ask is, are you really able to show the committees are powerful here? And do you really want to keep that as a central point of the paper? So one is, is expertise the basis of that power? But the prior question is, is there really, are you able to demonstrate that very well here? And I guess I'm not sure this is the right time to talk about that, but I think the sort of way you frame the paper has a lot to do with, how you tie it to the theoretical literature. What you do empirically it needs to be connected with the kind of theoretical juxtaposition that you're making in the first part of the paper.
I agree with that entirely. Just second it.
Yeah, I do want the paper to to assert that committees are still powerful. And I definitely agree that that at the moment is a glaring weakness in that I don't directly address that. I try to cite other literature that shows the continual recognition of committees exercising power in different realms and members thinking that their committee assignments are important and so on and so forth. But I'm not sure how to address that and then also move on to what I'm most interested in doing, which is argue that information expertise and knowledge become a persistent basis of committee power, even without institutional features that we, have presumed are important to committee power.
Here's an idea just off the cuff. I mean, this is it's not self-serving, but it's egocentric, I guess. But I mean, when I read your paper, I see a lot of instances of strategic use of information, but it's in a setting other than the committee floor setting, simplistically set up like Tom Gilligan and I did years and years ago. But it's still acquisition and transmission of information. So you could pitch it as such and just say that the institution changes for reasons you're not particularly knowledgeable about, but in spite of those changes, whatever's caused more action to be focused in leadership and constructing omnibuses and circumventing the committee process, it has not impeded the flow of information from experts to non-experts within the legislative body. So that's the durable feature. Institutions come and go, rules come and go. What we call rules changes, modifies, textbook Congress and all that. But the fundamentals stay the same. And the fundamentals here are some people know more about stuff than others, and the legislature figures out ways in which communication can occur in that environment.
I like that. Yeah.
I think it's a good point. It does raise Scott's question again, though, as to how expertise is accruing in the absence of the traditional way of committee hearings, markups, et cetera, where members are doing their homework on their committees.
You mean how it's acquired? You're talking about what are the incentives for acquisition?
Yes.
Yeah, I agree. That's a vacuum.
Yeah.
Well, so let me take it a tiny bit further than the way I was thinking about it a moment, as I was reading it, which is, I wonder if the only thing that really has changed here is they're just not reporting the bill, right? So the incentive is that they still get to write the bill, and that's the mark. That's what's worked from by the leadership, and that's what we amend on the floor. The only difference is the reporting isn't actually occurring. I don't actually know. I'm speculating here, and I'm hoping Jim knows better. But I'm wondering if that's the only thing that's changed.
You mean, for example, the Appropriations Committee is actually doing work and producing legislation, even though it's not guaranteed that it's going to get floor consideration in its current form, but might be stapled together in a CR.
Yes, right. Exactly. Right. It gets floor consideration, but it's.
And I mean, I think one way of interpreting these results is that eventually a stack of papers possibly stapled together over disparate areas is going to get consideration on the floor. And before it does, a lot of communications are going to go on, office to office, staff to staff, staff to leaders, who knows, a million dyads. And the outcome might not be all that different.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, the thing that's changed is they're no longer using the traditional committee process to mark up, debate, and pass the bills. And I think potentially, they're doing that, one, because it allows them to avoid a fight in committee, it allows them to avoid involving certain people, it allows them to avoid moving the bill into an open deliberative process that they don't have much control over, where leadership has more control over the floor. And two, it allows them to essentially actually cut out some members of the committee, even in the majority. They can write it among a smaller set without even having to worry about their votes. in committee or them getting drawn off by amendments from the minority or anything like that. It's just, and to some degree, they're obsessed with having control over this, having control over the bills and the process, and this is a way they can do it with fewer uncertainties.
The committee leaders.
The committee leaders and the party leadership sort of working together.
Right, yeah. So is this about committee power, or is it about committee leader power? Right? Because
I think,
going back to Keith's book, right? There are two senses in which you can talk about power. It can be distributive or informational, right? And that the informational story has a lot to do with the composition of the committee, the heterogeneity of preferences, for instance. Is the informational story going to work as well when you really have authority centralized in a committee chair, right? And is the chair then, a transmitter of information as an individual? Because it seems like that's a different, that's certainly a different kind of story that's a different story than you would tell, right? Keith, how would you make sense of that?
The thing that occurs to me when you say that is if that's the case, then you're certainly going to have long-term incentive problems.
Right.
Because nobody's going to sit around 40 years doing nothing for 39 of those until he becomes chairman.
I think it goes beyond just. I think ultimately, yes, the chairman has the most power in this because they're the person on top. They're leading the process of putting the bill together. They potentially have the most information, if only in part because they have the entirety of the committee majority staff working under them. But I think the committee leaders recognize they can't do it all on their own, and they do draw in a number of the committee members of the other committee members when crafting the bill. One, to draw on their expertise, two, to draw on their policy expertise and their committee expertise, and also to ensure their support if they've played a role in at least part of the bill. And so potentially that's the incentive for members to continue to develop expertise. The only way you're going to get the chairman or the ranking member to involve you in this is if you can demonstrate that you have some clout on this issue or this part of this issue that's going to be in this bill.
Or you have preferences that agree with the chair.
And absolutely that as well. Or even if your general preferences on this topic differ from the chair, potentially you align with the chair on part of it. And so then the chair goes to you and works with you to develop this part of the bill. So now you have an incentive to be a team player on this.
Jim, I think originally when I read the paper, and it seems like we're going in a bit of a different direction now, but the paper, the framing and the theory originally seems to be that you're setting up kind of an information versus parties story, and I don't think that came through clearly in the theory, but I worry that if we're talking about vesting a lot of this power in the committee leadership, it's hard for me to maybe separate that from a party story, and I'm not sure how your hypotheses that you develop really get an information story versus somebody who reviews this paper and is a party theorist and says, well, this could just be the parties again. Did that make sense?
It does make sense. I don't view them as opposed.
Okay.
I guess as part of it, I don't view that it has to be either or. I view that the parties can work in concert with the leaders on the committee and then other key members of the committee on whatever issue to craft the proposal and then basically get it directly to the floor.
Okay. I think that maybe needs to be more clear in the theory then, because though to be fair, I think the framing that Keith suggested maybe is taking this paper in a slightly different direction. I guess I would be cautious in saying that it's all in the committee leadership as opposed to the committee members.
Right, and I don't think it's just in leadership. I do think the leadership plays the largest role in this on any bill, but I don't think it's just the leaders. I think the leader can't do it all. The chair can't do it all by himself or herself. They have to draw on other members in some way.
One of the findings I really find interesting is that you find an effect for the position of the ranking minority member, right?
Yeah.
And I think you could do some more with that. Because, in effect, you've got So what you do is you just sort of throw in the stated position of the ranking minority member and the committee chair, and I think the subcommittee chair. But what you don't look at is how often what happens when the committee chair and the committee ranking minority member agree, right? Because those are really the conditions under which you would think the signal, the cue from the committee, is really going to be informative.
Yeah.
Right.
Before we get too deep in that, does anyone have anything else on theory and or moving on to research design?
One more thing I would say based on that is, I think what you're looking at in the empirics is direction, and I think your theory needs to be a little bit more clear in terms of the transmission of information as well as the direction that information is going. Is it the case that ranking members are a cue for, let's say, members of the majority to vote against that bill, as opposed to the chair who might be a cue to vote for it? Does that make, right? So it's like, could members on the other side look to somebody as a negative cue versus a positive cue? And that might be something you want to develop theoretically since you get that result.
Yeah, no, that's a good point.
Also, to flesh out the mechanics of the theory more, I keep getting these little pangs of Kingdon, his cue-taking book, where, if I recall correctly, he describes legislators having a need for knowledge or a need for information, and finding someone with preferences like theirs to ask about. And you had some stories like that in your interviews, and I think maybe you could get a little leverage off of Kingdon if that's the kind of information transmission you think is descriptive of the process, or at least some fraction of the process.
Yeah.
And that ties in with the notion Rick just raised about the ranking minority leader.
Right. Yeah.
Any other theory comments or research design related issues? Jim, I have one question on transitioning, I guess, from research design into empirics. It wasn't fully clear to me why you're focusing only on bills that are subject to an open rule amending process. That's both a very narrow subset of bills today. We were looking at less than 5% get open rules.
Right.
And it's also a non-random set of bills. There are presumably processes going on that determine whether something's considered an open amending process or not, which is in some ways going to be correlated, I think, with party goals and party strategies, at least. And so I was curious about why you made that choice and what you might be able to leverage by considering amendments under a structured process or a almost closed process, or something of that nature.
So I made that choice simply because the closed processes appear so scripted, and that they have a choice about which amendments they're going to allow on the floor. The committee has already vetted these amendments. There aren't amendments being offered under closed rules most of the time that the committee and the leadership believe actually could pass that they don't like. If they don't like them and they don't think they can pass, they don't allow them. And so that kind of very, very much limits their need to use cues or informational power to keep to try to influence the votes of the rest of the chamber, to try to keep the bill looking how they would like it to look and get it through unscathed. But let me flip that around and ask all of you. Would including amendments offered under more restricted procedures, would that be interesting as far as evidence of these sort of committee cues, or would you all discount that as meaningful in these regards?
Do committee chairs in your data, do they get rolled?
A couple times, not much.
Do the committees get rolled? The committee membership, do they get rolled?
Are there votes where the committee members are strongly in favor? And
the majority of the committee members oppose it,
right?
And it passes, or
I have not checked.
Well, the one thing is you have this. I guess and maybe, Jason, you'll tell me I'm jumping ahead too much, but you have this variable that works I'm trying to wrap my brain around it. So you have this, whether or not the sponsor is on the committee is always significant and negative.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That one really caught my eye, and I think that relates to Rick's question here, right?
I think so. My interpretation of that coefficient is that if you're a committee member and you're offering, and I would have to look into the data to confirm this, if you're a committee member and you're offering an amendment on the floor to this bill, it's because there wasn't support among the members of the committee or the committee leadership to get your policy language in the bill in the first place. If there was a committee markup, your amendment, it's likely an amendment that got rejected in committee.
That's so pretty good.
The committee members are already opposed to it. And if it wasn't a markup, it's something that the leadership was just declined to work with you on and get into the bill. And so these are amendments that don't have support. I don't have that in there because I sort of was running out of space and trying to keep this paper under a reasonable page limit.
Because it sort of stands out to me as a glaring inconsistency with the argument, and that's a much better explanation than I thought you could come up with. I shouldn't say explanation, I should say interpretation, which is code for post hoc rationalization.
Well, I have to say, I wondered if these were all minority party members, effectively, minority party committee members.
I think they're mostly minority party members, but I can't say that they're entirely minority party members.
On that, I have a related suggestion, and that is the first variable in your table, second variable in your table, ranking member signal. I would like to see that interacted with minority party.
Okay.
Because I think it would be compelling evidence of an informational effect if even interacting by minority party preserves the positive coefficient.
Since Jason made that point about only looking at those with closed or open rules, I had an issue with that as well. You kind of try to make the argument that it actually biases your results against your theory and hypotheses. I don't know. I didn't find that very convincing, and I know you asked us, and I'm just not sure what the answer is. But I think that's something you need to think about because those bills are being selected, right, by the leadership or the rules committee or whatever as bills that that there's something else going on with those that they're going to allow amendments on them, and I think that could be really problematic.
Right. Though I do think some of that selection process is simply just like norm and regular, it's like to some degree the way they've always done it. Most of them are spending bills. The rest of them are authorization bills, and since they've started restricting bills more, since they started doing that in the 80s, those are the two types of bills that have been less likely to touch. And I don't think it's entirely just because they're less wary of the bill being changed on the floor, but because they feel somewhat restrained by this norm of having spending bills and things like the defense authorization open for amendment.
I mean, that was another thing that really caught my eye, which was that these are almost entirely appropriations bills that we're looking at, the data, right?
Yeah.
It's 90% spending bills.
Yeah, and it's mainly appropriations bills, and those are the ones that got the most amendments anyway. So then the percentage of the amendments is overwhelmingly amendments to spending bills.
So I guess getting back to this question of whether or not we would be interested, or whether or we would discount legislation that had some sort of structured rule, or I guess I would want you to open this up beyond just simply the spending bills. That I wondered if we were looking at a phenomenon that was really restricted here to just appropriations.
Okay.
Appropriations probably tends to be a high specialization committee too.
Yeah.
Interesting to know whether the authors of these amendments come from the authorizing committees. Do you know anything about that?
Some of them do. I realized part of the way through I should have been coding that and haven't had time to go back, so I intend to code that. Broadly, I also wanted to, when it's a spending bill, I wanted to include signals from the leaders of the authorizing committee. And then if it wasn't a non-spending bill, I was hoping to include cues from the the leaders and the appropriations relevant subcommittee, but I have not gotten that finished yet. Because I feel those would be also obviously key members from committees that can claim to have expertise and jurisdiction over these issues, also sending out cues.
And more policy expertise than the appropriators do.
Right. Yeah. So in a lot of these bills, Barney Frank was very aggressive on the floor, as he typically was. And it's on spending bills, but it's on issues on these spending bills that deal with financial services and the financial services jurisdiction.
Yeah, actually, speaking of norms, Keith mentioned norms. One of the strong norms that I at least I've been told is a strong norm is even when the authorization is not passed for a particular agency, there's a lot of deference given to the authorizing committee in approving changes to the appropriations.
Yeah, yeah, yes. I think when they're legislating through these big spending bills, I think they bring in those, like the especially key players on those authorizing committees into those discussions. I can't think of a good example off the top of my head, but I don't think those lawmakers are left out when they're making all this policy language.
So I know we're bouncing around a little bit here, but you know, I really like the part where you're really looking. I mean, you look at the preference extremity of the author of the amendments, right? But have you looked at the preference extremity of the committee chair or the committee?
I have that in there, but I don't have it in the models.
Your data are nested, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're nested within jurisdictions, nested within years or congresses, right? So you know, for each amendment, you know something about the author, right? You know something about the committee chair's support or opposition. But you're not really looking at the characteristics of the committee membership that has jurisdiction, nor are you looking in terms of their preference heterogeneity, for instance, nor the extremity of the chair. Now, Keith's going to, suggest that you're not going to find very many extreme chairs, and I suspect that's right. Okay, but there's going to be some variation there, and I guess I would expect that you're going to find what you're going to find is that the queue is going to be stronger from. It's going to be weaker from a preference outlying chair, except where you've got a committee chair and a ranking minority member in agreement.
Right.
Before you answer that, I have a more fundamental question, which is I'm not sure what your variable is. Because it seemed to me you defined it two ways within the scope of the 2 pages. Somewhere I have a note on this. Yeah, pages 18 and 21 seem different.
For the extremity measures?
Yeah. On page 18, it looks like so it's the absolute value of each amendment sponsor's first dimension denominated score. So that sounds like it's just the distance from the 0 point.
Mm-hmm.
And leaving aside the minor issue that the 0 point has no special theoretical significance whatsoever, unless it happens to just be close to the median because it's in the middle. That's easy to fix.
Okay.
But I don't say it's the absolute value of the distance from the median.
Okay. That's a.
I don't see how you can rationalize that measure, because if Rick has an ideal point exactly, let's say that distance is 0.9 on a -1 to +1 scale. The sponsor has a 0.9 ideal point. Rick has a 0.9 ideal point. Rick is going to be blissed out by this proposal, but it's going to be scored as an extreme proposal.
So in the tables, in the regression where I have where the unit of analysis is each member voting, the measure is the difference between the voting member and the sponsor. It's only in the
Okay.
amendment level analysis that it's just like that the control is generally just distance from
The
zero.
variable is different in the two tables.
Yeah, they're two different variables, and I should probably make that clearer by giving them different, slightly more clearly different names.
That's what I missed. Either way, any way you do it, though, you're going to have a problem. And the problem is that it will be easy to construct scenarios where the measure doesn't do what you want to do, because fundamentally what it depends upon is the bill and the status quo point, and the proximity to the point between the two.
Right.
And that's information you just don't have and can't have. So, I mean, I don't want to be the bearer of bad news, but I think there's no way you can get a variable that is going to be truly intelligible in its interpretation.
Yeah.
Which is unfortunate, because that's, it's a potentially really nice finding.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I don't think it's a great measure of what I'm trying to measure, but I'm not sure what improvement can be made.
Yeah. I think probably the most transparent is the proximity from the median.
Keith, you're saying in both instances, doing it as the support for the amendment, and then whether or not it passes, you're saying the distance from the median is the most useful piece of information?
Yeah, I say that. I say that with some tentativeness, because I haven't thought through all the possibilities. But I mean, if you want it,
right.
Another thing is you should label the amendment. I mean, you should label the variable what it is.
Okay.
Instead of just saying DW nominate on the table.
Okay.
Say extremity of proposer from median, or distance of proposer from median.
Yeah, definitely.
So,
and I guess implicitly what you're doing is you're making a presumption that people are going to propose their ideal points, and the obnoxiousness of the. I'm going to retract now. Suppose we do the opposite and take the distance between the proposer, who you call a sponsor, and the voter, whose behavior we're trying to predict. Then you're arguing that the voters' like or dislike of the amendment is going to be a function of the distance between him and the proposer.
Yeah.
Which has a secondary implication that you're thinking the proposer is going to propose his ideal point.
Right.
We know from various games we could write down that that's not always going to be an equilibrium strategy.
Right. Which I agree. I don't think that
Yeah.
in reality that most of these amendments look exactly like that in any way. Like, and I can pull out cases from the data where you have a relatively extreme Republican or Democrat proposing something that's very centrist and moderate. But I don't know how to. It's a very rough guide. Though I think there is some. I think the best thing that there is to it, like the best defense I can give of it, is that members carry around these reputations, and I think nominate. The one thing I can say for nominate, not loving it as a measure, generally speaking, is that it does reflect fairly well the type of reputation that a member carries around Washington for being relatively moderate or relatively extreme within their party. And that may color the view that a voting member of Congress has of the proposal.
Well, so I don't want to speak for Keith here, but I think he's convinced me as I'm thinking through this that distance from the median, as long as you're willing to make a few assumptions here, right, is about as good as you can get. And Keith, correct me if I'm misinterpreting what you're saying here, but members basically can calibrate the usefulness. Well, they can calibrate what the signal is by knowing that distance, having your hope, some idea of approximately where the status quo is, and then using and assuming that they introduce at their ideal point or they amend at their ideal point, then you can kind of figure out whether or not, knowing all that whole package of information, whether or not I should or shouldn't support the amendment. I think that's kind of what Keith is getting at.
I'm really not sure what I'm getting at.
Well, I think there's a...
But I do know this, that whenever I see one of these papers, and there are jillions of them, that have distance between nominate this and nominate that, it's easy to draw an example where the variable does not do what you would hope it would do, because you don't know you don't know all of the. I mean, it's under-identified. You don't have the information you need to define the strategic situation.
Yeah. I agree with that completely. I don't think it's a great measure, but I'm not sure what other measure I can use that would be satisfactory.
Well, you know, I think one of the issues at work here is, you know, a distinction you don't make in the paper is between, you know, sort of influence and agreement, right? So, you know, are these chairs either sincerely or strategically basically taking the median position? And so, you know, they're always winning?
Right.
Or is it, or, you know, I mean, if power is defined as a causal connection between the preferences of the actor and an outcome, and we can't measure where the outcome is, and we don't have really good measures of what the preferences are, I mean, those are big problems. But I guess you know, if you're going to talk about whether these chairs are powerful or the ranking minority members are powerful, again, I would like to come back and know something about, you know, how centrist these chairs are. Because the chairs could just be agents of the majority, right? That they have preference, that, you know, they're representative of the chamber. They bring bills to the floor that reflect those preferences, and they pass, right? It could be that, or it could be that there's, you know, the outcome on the amendment is succeeding or failing for other reasons, right, that have to do with the information and expertise, so they're persuading the chair to take a different position. But it's just really hard to discriminate between these things.
Yeah,
So,
it's.
Jim,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I agree, it is hard to discriminate from them. I don't think chairs are just sort of like bringing forward something that can pass, and that's this, like, the sole consideration. I think that's one of numerous considerations for what's being put together among the key committee players and the party leadership and so on. I think especially when we're talking about amendments, that's where I think it potentially is easier to see that most members coming to the floor and offering an amendment on the bill aren't just offering an amendment to get an amendment to pass. I think they're offering something that they legitimately want to see happen to the bill, or they're trying to do something, attack the bill in some way by offering some sort of poison pill amendment or message amendment. And this is where I think this is part of the reason why I chose to try to use committee votes or amendment votes as the way to approach this, because I think you can take away some of the concerns that the committee chair is just, and the ranking member and all of them are just sort of reflecting what they think the majority on the floor already wants to hear.
You code their Q as their statements on the floor. Am I remembering that correctly? Does
Yes.
that actually match how they vote on the amendment? Because I think that's interesting and important. Okay, it does.
I don't have like a full analysis of that, but generally from what I did look at, and I could easily after this pull this up and double check, I'm pretty sure 99% of the time when they say they vote consistent with what they say.
Okay. One other, we were talking about some of the results in Table 2, and we talked about whether the sponsors on the committee and how that's a negative effect. One of the other weird things that's going on is that if the sponsor is in the majority, that has a negative effect on majority lawmakers and a positive effect on minority lawmakers.
Which table is this?
Table 2.
Oh, yeah.
Do you have an explanation for what's going on there?
I think it's simply that generally speaking, across all these amendments, most majority members of Congress vote against most of the amendments, and most minority members of Congress vote for most of the amendments. So with that table being split between one column just being the majority lawmakers,
Yeah,
they're voting against, their rate of supporting an amendment is really low in general. And so that
tabular of that, then I don't think
Sorry?
I would know that. I think a crosstab of that would be
okay.
data to have in the paper.
Okay.
While we're on that table, what do you make of the negative coefficient on seniority of sponsor for minority?
For men, well, I don't know. It's a good question. Yeah.
I thought you were going to have another good one.
I don't have a good explanation for that one.
I'm kind of disappointed.
I would have to think about that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I wonder theoretically, again, if you could go back to thinking a little bit more about direction the queue is going, if that would help you kind of suss out some of these effects and make some more precise predictions about what's going on here with some of these directions. Because it seems empirically like you're looking at direction, but I'm just not sure that comes through in the theory.
Right.
Any more thoughts on empirics?
I just one methodological matter. You've got a multi-level. This is multi-level data. You don't treat it that way, do you?
No.
Yeah, you're not going to get by with that. You've got to estimate some sort of mixed model here, right? Because you've got multiple levels, right? Individuals within committees, within parties, within chambers. So you've got a lot of, you're violating the independence assumption all over the place. And so you're going to have to, I'm not the person to advise you on how to do this, but you're going to have to deal with it. And at least failing to do it usually means that you're grossly underestimating your standard errors. I don't know how much that's going to change your results because it looks like your standard errors are really small relative to the size of the coefficients, but somebody, when you submit this for review, somebody's going to give you trouble over it.
Yeah, I'd agree with Rick on that.
If we're on miscellaneous comments, I've got one other comment that I want to make. There are a couple of places in the paper where you commit what I call the fallacy of institutions, where you write that institutions aren't used and therefore they're not important. One page that I marked was first full paragraph of page 6. I don't remember offhand what it was. Yeah, it's after you give your overview and showed that various procedures aren't used anymore.
Okay.
You say things like bills no longer go to conference. Well, the easier one to talk about is gatekeeping. Just because a committee isn't discharged doesn't mean that the discharge petition rule is ineffectual.
Right.
Because of the anticipated behavior.
Right.
That's something we all do, but I just wanted to flag it.
No, that's great. That's a great point.
I think there's another instance or two in the paper where you do it, but I don't have them written down.
I think I could probably identify them pretty quickly.
Any other empirical thoughts?
Is it worth thinking about the importance of the legislation these amendments are being offered on?
Possibly. I think most of them are relatively important bills.
But see, that's something you can do with
Yeah,
just on the multi-level stuff. You can just put in bill fixed effects,
right.
right? I don't think you're trying to explain the variation across bills, are you?
No.
So, yeah, I mean, that's a really important concern. If you really want to explain the cross-bill variation, then you can't do that. But
Right.
Yeah.
Right. No. Yeah.
I mean, again, they're almost all appropriations bills.
Right. Which are all relatively important.
Right. I'm not arguing against Rick the putting in the fixed effects for
Yeah.
bill level, although, well, I'm assuming there are multiple amendments per bill.
Yes.
Frequently, right? Your ends are about a little over 1,000.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's a lot of them. And the average probably per bill, and I don't know this off the top of my head, but is a good amount. It's not. Most of these aren't a bill with one amendment. There's only a couple of those.
Right. And then, of course, when you do the individual level voting, the bill fixed effects is even more important.
Right.
mm-hmm.
Should we move on to a round of miscellaneous / closing thoughts? Rick, you have anything?
I would just come back to, I think I guess the point I started with, and I really like the way, sort of Keith captured it. I mean, I really see this as being, I really like this paper. I think it's the best Q-giving paper I've seen in a very long time, or at least one of the maybe two best. And I think that, sort of focusing there and talking about the role of committee chairs or committee leaders as being Q-givers is just really nice. And it has all these implications, right? I mean, some of which you can't sort of demonstrate, in a, really convincing way about, what this means for committee power, for instance. It's consistent with, a story about the reasons why legislators who don't specialize on a committee need to rely on expert informants. And the expert informants in this case are the committee leaders. And I think that's a really strong part of this paper. And if that's all that it was, if it was only a paper about committee leader Q giving, that would be a very nice paper. And your reviewers may raise a lot of the concerns we've raised here, and may push you around. But I think if you end up coming back to just that, then I think you've got a really good paper here.
Jason, can I jump in because I'm going to have to run to a fact?
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you, everybody. I really like the conversation we've had around this paper, and one of the things that I think could be even emphasized a little bit more, again, getting back to the sort of context of the paper is, committees are still relevant, but we need to understand how that is the case when we hear all of this description of Congress as really being a top-down process where committees are sort of not really part of the game anymore. And I think that this is a great way to capture that, and I really like the way Keith has said, let's look at committee power as it manifests itself, no matter what the institutional arrangements or the norms look like. We seem to defer to this kind of signaling from expertise. And so I think that's a good way to sort of put this all together.
Great, thank you.
Thanks. I'm going to have to run, everyone.
Yeah, thanks, Scott.
Hey, thanks, Scott.
Hey, Scott.
Take care.
I have just a couple of things. One is I have a list of quibbles, which are too picky to mention, but I'll email them to you.
Okay.
Over like sentences that were confusing and easily fixable, stuff like that.
Okay.
The one semi-significant thing I wanted to say, which came up a little bit indirectly earlier, is that I think you can't really infer anything about power over outcomes here.
Right.
But that's not a killer concern, because I think what you're talking about is influence over behavior. Behavior which is directly related to outcomes, but I just wouldn't take that second step.
Okay.
Well, yeah, but the first part of the analysis is on whether amendments pass. So that's different. Certainly in the second part of the analysis where it's votes, that's over behavior. But
well, both parts of the analysis have behavior in them. But I'm just saying he can't infer anything about, say, the spatial location
I agree completely.
of the collective choice. He's talking about individuals' behavior in a collective choice process at various stages of the process.
But the amendments that he's measuring are collective choices, not individual choices. Right?
Yeah.
So that's where I think
aggregated individual choices.
Right.
Josh, you have anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody's, kind of said what I was going to say, which is it's a really interesting paper. I really like the direction that we've kind of discussed today, and a key suggestion about thinking about information transmission despite maybe a decline in institutional power. And I think I would really encourage you to think about a lot of the different types of inferences you can make, because you have this data set and you're going to get you have a lot of really interesting results about different types of people doing different things, and I really want you to kind of unpack those results and theorize and say, we expect these type of people to push it this way, these type of people to push it a different way, and I think that could make for a really interesting paper if you can point to specific effects coming from sponsors, ranking members, committee chairs, right, that are contingent maybe on the preferences of the people who are voting relative to the preferences of the sponsor and the committees.
Right.
That's it.
Okay.
Jim, you have any last thoughts?
Just thank you guys so much. This is tremendous feedback, and I have no doubt that as I work to incorporate it, it's going to make this a much stronger paper. And really, thank you for taking the time to read it. Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Yes,
I really appreciate you guys taking the time to read it and give me this kind of feedback. It's really great.
Yeah, on behalf of Nate, thanks to all of you as well. I know we're all busy, so it's really nice to do these things. So thank you all.
It's fun.
Thank you.
Jim, do I have your email address?
It should be on the email that came from Peter about about this. If not, I can email you.
I'm trying to find it.
Okay.
Okay, see ya.